They thought they had it all figured out. My son and his wife believed that by the time I understood what was happening, it would already be too late. What they didn't count on was that 63 years of living teaches a man how to be still, how to wait, and how to read the room before anyone knows he's paying attention. I'm going to tell you what happened. All of it. Because the truth deserves to be said out loud. My name is Owen. I'm 67 years old. I spent 31 years as a licensed electrician, worked my way up to running my own contracting business out of Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and retired 4 years ago with a paid-off house, a modest savings account, and the belief that I had done right by my family. I raised 2 kids mostly on my own after their mother passed from ovarian cancer when they were still in middle school. My son Caleb was 13. My daughter Rose was 11. I worked double shifts, packed their lunches, drove them to every school play and every soccer game and every college orientation. I didn't remarry. I didn't want to. The house felt complete enough with the 3 of us. Caleb grew up sharp, charming too. He could talk his way into or out of anything, and for a long time I thought that was a gift. He married a woman named Vanessa about 8 years ago. She came from money, or at least she liked people to think she did. The kind of woman who corrects the way you hold your fork at Thanksgiving and calls it just a suggestion. I tried to like her. I genuinely did. But there was always something behind her eyes when she looked at me, like she was calculating something I wasn't supposed to know about. Rose turned out quieter. More like me, I suppose. She settled in Nashville, married a good man named Tom, and they have a daughter named Abby who is the single greatest thing that has ever happened to me. Rose calls every Sunday she remembers my birthday without a reminder. She still calls me Dad, like she means it. Caleb calls when he needs something. I should have seen it earlier, but I'm getting ahead of myself. It started the summer before last, at my birthday cookout. I had just turned 66. Caleb and Vanessa came up from Philadelphia, which they rarely did anymore, and I remember thinking it was nice to have the driveway full. Abby was running through the sprinkler in the backyard. My neighbor Doug was at the grill. It felt like the kind of afternoon you want to hold on to. Caleb pulled me aside around 3 o'clock. He said he needed to talk to me about the house situation. I didn't know there was a house situation, so I asked him what he meant. He told me that property taxes in my neighborhood had gone up considerably, which was true, I knew that, and that he had been thinking about my long-term stability. He said it casually, like we were just 2 men talking about the weather, but his hands were in his pockets, and he wasn't quite meeting my eyes. He said he and Vanessa had been talking, and they thought it might make sense for me to put the house in both our names. Joint ownership. That way, he said, if anything ever happened to me, there would be no probate, no delays, no complications. He made it sound like a favor he was doing for me. I told him I'd think about it. He smiled and went back to the potato salad. I didn't think about it the way he hoped I would. I thought about it the way my father taught me to think about things, which is to say, I sat with it quietly for several days and asked myself what the other person stood to gain. My father was a quiet man from Western Virginia who said very little but meant every word of it. He used to say, "Owen, when somebody offers to help you for free, find out what free is going to cost you." I called Rose that Sunday, like I always do. I mentioned what Caleb had said, just in passing. She went quiet for a moment and then said, "Dad, please don't sign anything without talking to someone first." I told her I wouldn't. She said it twice. A few weeks went by. Then Caleb started calling more frequently. That alone told me something. He would call on a Tuesday afternoon just to chat, which he had never done in living memory. Vanessa even sent me a gift basket in September, which she had also never done. Expensive cheeses and a bottle of red wine. I'll be honest, I enjoyed quite a bit. But I understood it for what it was. Then in October, Caleb drove up on a Friday by himself. He said he had a work meeting in the area. Maybe true. He sat at my kitchen table and we drank coffee, and after about 20 minutes of small talk, he slid an envelope across to me. He said it was just a paperwork for the joint ownership arrangement. Nothing complicated, just a formality. The lawyer already looked it over. I looked at the envelope. I looked at him. I told him I'd read it over the weekend. He didn't love that answer. He shifted in his chair and said I shouldn't have to read it carefully. It was boilerplate stuff. I told him that I always read what I sign. I said it pleasantly. He left about an hour later, and I washed his car back out of the driveway, and I stood at the kitchen window for a while after it was gone. That evening, I opened the envelope. It was not a joint ownership arrangement. I'm not a lawyer, and some of the language took me a few readings to untangle. But what I was looking at was a deed transfer, not joint ownership. Full transfer. My name, coming off the deed entirely. Caleb and Vanessa's names going on. There was a small consideration listed, $5,000, which in Pennsylvania real estate law means it counts as a legal sale, which means it's much harder to undo. $5,000 for a house worth $430,000. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time that night. I didn't call anyone. I made myself a cup of decaf, and I sat there and I felt something I don't have a precise word for, not rage. Not yet. Something colder than that. The feeling you get when you finally understand something that was always true, but that you had been too generous to see clearly. My father left me one thing of real value when he died. Besides the lessons, it was his watch, a Belova automatic from 1971 that he had bought himself the year he paid off his own house in full. He wore it every day until his hands got too stiff for the clasp, and then he gave it to me on a Christmas morning when I was in my late 30s and said, "That watch has been on an honest man's wrist its whole life. Keep it that way." It has a small scratch on the crystal from the time he was helping a friend repair a fence and caught it on a nail. I never had the scratch fixed. It's part of it. That watch was sitting on my nightstand the night I read those papers. I picked it up before I went to bed and held it for a minute. I thought about my father and what he would have said. He would not have said much. He would have picked up the phone and called someone who knew what to do. The next Monday morning, I called a real estate attorney in Harrisburg named Patricia Howell. I had known her name through a friend of mine who had used her for an estate dispute a few years back. I described the documents to her. She asked me to come in. Her office was on the second floor of a narrow brick building on State Street. The kind of office with framed law degrees and old wooden furniture that has seen a lot of difficult conversations. She was in her late 50s. Direct. No wasted words. She looked at the papers for a few minutes without saying anything. Then she looked at me over her reading glasses and said, "Did you sign these?" I told her no. She said, "Good." Just that one word. But the way she said it told me the situation could have been a great deal worse. She explained it clearly. If I had signed, I would have legally transferred my primary residence for a consideration of $5,000. She said that while there are legal mechanisms to challenge such transfers, inadequate consideration, undue influence, they require court action, they take time, and they're not guaranteed. She said she had seen families spend more in legal fees fighting a transfer than the house was worth. She was not saying this to scare me. She was saying it so I understood what had been sitting in that envelope. She asked me how I wanted to proceed. I told her I wanted to understand everything first. All of it. I wanted to know if there were other things I hadn't seen. She suggested we check a few things. It took about 2 weeks. What we found was this. Caleb had taken out a home equity line of credit against my house 14 months earlier. He had done it using a power of attorney document that I had signed 6 years ago when I had a minor medical procedure and needed someone to handle my affairs temporarily. A document I had never revoked because it had never occurred to me that I needed to. Technically, under Pennsylvania law at the time of the transaction, it was not forged, but my attorney said the use of it was legally questionable at best, and in her professional view, exploitive in intent. He had drawn $60,000 from it. I'm going to stop here for a moment because I think it is important that you understand something. I am not a man who cries easily. I cried when my wife died. I cried when Rose was born, and again when Abby was born. Those are the times I can remember clearly. When my attorney told me about the $60,000, I didn't cry. I just nodded slowly and looked at the framed degree on her wall and thought about Caleb as a 13-year-old boy, sitting in the passenger seat of my truck on the way home from his mother's funeral, not saying anything, just watching the road go by. I thought about what I had given that boy. Everything I had, I gave to him, all of it willingly. And somehow, it had produced this. Patricia told me the path forward. We filed to revoke the power of attorney immediately, which is a straightforward legal step. We also engaged the bank regarding the HELOC, providing documentation of the limited and temporary nature of the original POA and the circumstances under which it had been granted. The bank's fraud review department took it from there. She also advised me to change the locks, update my estate documents, and consult with a financial advisor about my accounts, all of which I did within the same month. I did not call Caleb during this time. Not once. I let him keep calling me. I answered sometimes, kept it short, said everything was fine. He asked once if I had gotten around to looking at those papers, and I said I had set them aside and would get to them when I had a moment. He laughed a little, relieved. That laugh sits in my memory differently now. Rose flew up from Nashville in November. I hadn't asked her to come, but I had told her what was happening, and she said she needed to be there. We sat at the same kitchen table where Caleb had slid that envelope across to me, and I told her everything, and she held my hand across the table and didn't say much for a while. Then she said, "Dad, I'm so sorry you've been carrying this alone." I told her I was okay. She said she knew I was, but that she was sorry anyway. Abby was too young to understand any of it. She just wanted to help me bake the banana bread I always make when she visits, so we did that. The kitchen smelled like warm sugar and vanilla, and it was the most normal I had felt in months. It was the first week of December when the bank notified Caleb that the HELOC account had been flagged and that the circumstances of the original authorization were under review. I imagined that was a difficult phone call for him to receive. He called me that same day. His voice was different, tighter. He said he needed to come talk to me, and I said that was fine. Come ahead. He arrived 2 days later. Vanessa did not come with him. I noticed that. He sat in the same chair he always sits in at my kitchen table, and he looked like a man who had been awake for several nights, which I suspected was accurate. He started by saying that there had been a misunderstanding with some financial paperwork. I let him talk. He said the power of attorney had been used for what he considered a legitimate reason, that he had planned to pay it back, that things had gotten away from him with some investment decisions that didn't work out. He said all of this quickly, the way people talk when they've rehearsed something but can feel it isn't landing the way they hoped. I waited until he finished. Then I said, "Caleb, I know about the deed transfer too." The room went very quiet. He looked at me for a moment. Then he looked down at the table. He didn't say anything for a long time. When he did speak, his voice was quieter than I had ever heard it. He said, "I didn't think you'd figure it out." I told him that was the problem, that he had built the whole thing on the assumption that I wouldn't notice, wouldn't ask, wouldn't understand. He had looked at his 66-year-old father and decided I was safe to take advantage of. I didn't say this with anger. I said it the way my father would have said it. Plainly, because it deserved to be said plainly. He started crying then. And I want to be honest with you, it affected me. He is still my son. That is not a thing that changes just because a person has done something terrible. But I had learned something over the previous months, sitting in a real estate attorney's office and reading bank statements and revoking legal documents. I had learned the difference between loving someone and protecting yourself from someone. Those two things can exist at the same time. They can coexist in the same kitchen on a Tuesday afternoon in December. I told him that the bank matter was being handled by their fraud review department and that I did not have the ability to stop that process even if I wanted to. That was not entirely true, but it was mostly true, and more importantly, it was the right thing to say. I told him that if he cooperated fully with the bank's review and made arrangements to repay the $60,000, I would not pursue additional legal action against him personally. I told him that the power of attorney was revoked and that no document of that kind would ever be signed again. I told him that my estate documents had been updated and that if he was expecting an inheritance structured in a particular way, he should adjust his expectations. He nodded at everything I said. He asked if we could still have a relationship. I told him that was up to him. I said it quietly and I meant it. He left that evening, and I stood at the window again and watched the car go down the street until the taillights disappeared. It was cold out. The neighbors' Christmas lights were already up. The bank's fraud review concluded in February. Caleb agreed to a repayment arrangement. The deed transfer paperwork, the unsigned version, still sitting in my attorney's file, went nowhere. My name remained on the deed of my house, the house I had bought 22 years ago and finished paying off in 2019. It stayed mine. Rose came back up in the spring with Tom and Abby. We planted tomatoes in the back garden like we do every year. Abby got dirt on her shoes and thought it was the funniest thing that had ever happened to anyone. She asked me if she could wear my watch while we were in the garden, and I let her put it on her little wrist where it hung loose and enormous, and she held her arm up to show Tom with the most serious expression. I took a photo of that. Caleb and I have spoken a handful of times since December. The calls are short, civil. I don't know what we are to each other right now, and I'd made peace with not knowing. Some things take longer to find their shape than you expect. Maybe there is a version of this story where we find our way back to something real. I am 67 years old, and I have learned not to close doors all the way. But I have also learned that leaving a door open is not the same as walking through it before you're ready. What I know is this: the house is still mine. The watch is still honest. And every Sunday morning when Rose calls, she asks me how I'm doing, and I tell her, and I mean it when I say I'm okay. My father bought that Belova the year he paid off his own house in full. He wore it every day on an honest man's wrists until his hands wouldn't let him anymore, and then he gave it to me. I've worn it every day since. There's a scratch on the crystal from a fence post that caught it on a cold afternoon in Virginia, and I have never had it fixed, because the scratch is part of the story, and the story is the whole point. I said I would keep it that way. I did. I've had a lot of time to sit with what happened, not to replay it over and over the way some people do, turning it like a stone in their pocket until it wears smooth, just to understand it, because I think understanding something is different from forgiving it, and both of those things are different from forgetting it, and I'm not interested in pretending they're the same. What Caleb did came from somewhere. I know that. It didn't come from nowhere, and it didn't come from evil, not in the dramatic sense of that word. It came from a slow accumulation of small choices he made over years to prioritize what was easy over what was right, to assume that the people who loved him most would never look too closely, to mistake patience for weakness and loyalty for leverage. That's how most betrayals actually work. Not one terrible decision, but 100 small ones that nobody catches until the weight of them finally shows. And I played a part in that, not in what he did. That was his choice, and I own none of it. But I spent a long time being the kind of father who fixed things without requiring accountability. When Caleb made mistakes when he was younger, I handled them quietly, without much consequence for him. I thought I was protecting him. I think now that I was teaching him, without meaning to, that there would always be a net under him, that the people who loved him would absorb the cost of his decisions so he wouldn't have to. A man reaps what he tends. Not as punishment, not as some cosmic ledger being balanced, just as the natural result of what he practiced. Caleb practiced taking the easy road. He practiced assuming others wouldn't notice. He practiced treating the people closest to him as resources rather than as people. And eventually those practices led him exactly to that kitchen table, sliding a fraudulent deed transfer across to a 66-year-old father on a Friday afternoon, believing I was too old, or too trusting, or too tired to read what I was signing. He was wrong, and being wrong cost him significantly more than he had planned for. What I learned, or maybe what I remembered, because I think my father tried to teach me this a long time ago, is that intelligence without integrity doesn't protect you. It just makes you better at getting into trouble you can't get back out of. And toughness without wisdom is the same. You can be stubborn all the way to the edge of something, and still have no idea how close you are. The combination that actually carries a person to hard things is knowing what's right, having the courage to act on it even when it's uncomfortable, and being patient enough to wait for the truth to do what truth eventually does. I didn't raise my voice at Caleb when he sat in my kitchen that December. I didn't need to. The facts were louder than anything I could have said. Rose never raised her voice either. She just showed up, held my hand across the table, and made banana bread with Abby while the world sorted itself out around us. That's a different kind of strength, and I've come to think it might be the more valuable one. The house is still mine. The watch still runs. And every Sunday, Rose calls. That's enough. That has always been enough.